We're going to continue with the second part of our lecture, which is looking at the balance of the chapter on an introduction to the supply chain. We have a part of the supply chain that has to do with what we call the development chain. And as we mentioned earlier in our last presentation, that there is a development chain and then there's a supply chain, and the two things actually come together. So the development chain is really a set of activities and processes associated with new product introduction. And so there's usually a design stage. Then one has to determine what sort of capabilities and knowledge that the organization has to have. We need to decide who we're going to source from, and of course what your production plans are going to look like. So if you're producing a new cell phone, or if you're producing hard drives, or if you're producing automobile parts and so on, if you design something new, once you've designed that and you have a production plan to get this product out there, the supply chain has now a major role to play in terms of sourcing raw materials, bringing it to the manufacturing stage, and then of course shipping that out to your to the various downstream components of your supply chain. All right, the warehouses, the retailers, and then to the customers in the end. So this is kind of what it looks like. You see here, plan, design, your source, and then some decisions have to be made here, which is like, what is the nature of the product architecture? What does it look like? So, for example, Dell's computers are very modular. Computers in general are very modular, and so you would need to decide in some cases, are you going to make certain parts of that product, or are you going to actually purchase certain parts of that product, etc. And when we get down to the supply chain, we see we supply, produce, distribute, and sell. So the interface between those two chains happen here at the sort of production stage. All right. In terms of trying to get the best efficiencies out of a supply chain, when you have parts of the chain that are all across the globe, and nowadays we know that supply chains are not that simple where all the parts of the supply chain exist in the same locale as the facility that is actually doing the production. So if you think of a hamburger, for example, my God, you have parts of that hamburger that comes from Brazil, Germany, Saudi Arabia, North America, all those sorts of things. The wheat from Canada, and other parts of the U.S. as well. So all the things that go into that product can come from anywhere across the globe. So when you have a geographically dispersed network, you have to now get into what we call global optimization. That is optimizing the overall supply chain. And if you have different individuals controlling different parts of the chain, they do not necessarily work together collaboratively. And so it's possible to have conflicting objectives for the different facilities. One might want to optimize service, the other one might want to optimize costs, the other one might want to maximize throughput, and so all those things make for complexities. All right. We have the supply chain being really a dynamic system. It is not static. You cannot design it in 1999 and expect that in 2013 it will be the same, because the conditions are not the same. The supply chain must respond to changes in the environment. And so if you have new products, if you have new materials, if you have new information, if you have new technologies, the supply chain must change as well. So the variations over time, and of course the principal objective of that supply chain is to really bring about some match between demand and supply. So if demand is fluctuating, then supply has to fluctuate. If the supply is fluctuating, you may not be able to influence, you may have to find ways to try to influence the demand, but the important thing is to bring about a balance between those two. And so you do that by managing parts of the system that involve things like your levels of inventory and the back orders that you will incur as a result. And then you have things like offshoring, outsourcing, lean production. Well, those have actually created certain risks as well too. Lean production essentially tries to really do what you call a pull system, where we don't manufacture until we actually get demand. Now, one might think that this is great from the standpoint of, say, minimizing inventory related costs, but for a manufacturer who has a very capital intensive facility, receiving orders one at a time is not going to be very helpful. That manufacturer typically wants to produce as much as possible to get economies of scale. And to do so means that you make to stock, not you make to order. And so there will be some conflict in the system where the manufacturer wants to make to order, but then say the retailer is saying, no, I'm only going to actually stock exactly what my customers demand. And so I will pull rather than simply just stockpiling because the manufacturer suggests that I need to do this to really reduce their costs. So that's an issue. Offshoring and outsourcing, we hear those two terms, they're different. Offshoring is when you take your facilities offshore, but you still own it. And of course, the climate within which, or the environment within which you are offshoring, has implications for efficiencies. What kind of transportation system is there? What are the currency fluctuations or stability issues, labor productivity issues, and so forth. And that is also a decision that you would consider if you decide to outsource. Now, when you're outsourcing, you do not control the facility, but you establish a relationship with the outsourcer. And in some cases, you may or may not achieve the kind of performance that you're looking for, because that outsourcer is serving multiple customers. And so it's not uncommon to hear that the relationship between the outsourcer and the company actually breaks down because there's a lack of compliance with the sort of specs around performance and service, etc. So those things are important issues. So here is just another example again of the complexity of supply chains, but also really showing you a global supply chain. If you look at apparel manufacture, that is one where there are usually a lot of global players. Let's just get back to this here quickly. So the retail outlets, the department stores, the specialty stores, mass merchandise chains, and so forth, discount chains, they, as you can see, would have to then place orders to the distributors, right? And so you have the sort of distributors, or the export networks, the people who are responsible for taking the product from wherever it was manufactured to get it out to those stores. You have branded named apparel companies over here. Over here, and then you have overseas buying offices, you have trading companies. These are all people, and those could be anywhere. They could be in Asia, they could be in Europe, they could be in North America. And then you see the apparel manufacturers. In some cases, you may have some of them actually doing the manufacturing in North America, some of them doing it in the Caribbean and Mexico. So the Caribbean Basin Initiative contractors would take care of that. In Asia, like Hong Kong is very popular, of course, parts of China, Malaysia, and so on. Singapore, you would have Asian garment contractors, domestic overseas contractors, and then the textile companies could come from anywhere. They could come from Korea, they could come from Japan. So you have fabric weaving, yarn spinning, petrochemicals, and then you go back even further to where the cotton fields, cotton, wool, and silk, oil, and natural gas manufacture. So these are all parts of the thing, and they could come from different places. So raw material networks to component networks to the production networks to the export networks and then to the market networks, if you wish. So how many countries does it take to make a coat? And you can see here a number of countries are actually involved in making this coat. Taiwan specializes in making material for the outdoor clothing. You have Germany, which gave us the sort of snap fastener Japan, they are very well known for zip manufacturers. Thailand for making fake wool or fur. China for the actual production itself, but it also produces cotton. And so a number of countries come together to produce that product. So we're talking about really global supply chains, all right? And this is just another diagram that shows what that looks like, how global supply chains can be. So what are some of the things that drive uncertainty and risk in supply chains? And those things are important to give consideration to them, because you have to manage the supply chain for uncertainty and risk. We see raw material shortages could happen in some cases. You could have strikes, internal supply and supplier part shortages, productivity inefficiencies, and we see that Boeing's aircraft inventory write-down of $2.6 billion. So clearly, if you're talking about write-down of inventory, it probably didn't forecast properly, and had to write off a whole lot of inventory. All right, sales and earnings shortfall, larger than anticipated inventory. So these are all examples. An example here is sales at the U.S. Surgical Corporation declined 25%, resulting in a loss of $22 million. Well, sales could have been because of maybe a case where they over forecasted sales and in the end end up selling less. Stiff competition could happen, higher than expected orders for new products. You could have currency changes, all of those things could actually cause that. One of the things that we know is that fluctuation in actual demand could actually cause fluctuation downstream. So if customer demand variability will affect the variability in inventory levels at, say, a distribution center, then the distribution center must now place orders to the manufacturer. Well, guess what? That uncertainty now is compounded and passed on to the manufacturer. And then the manufacturer must now place orders to retailers, or not retailers, sorry, suppliers of raw materials. And so you're cascading the uncertainty throughout the supply chain, and that becomes quite difficult, right? So forecasting is usually not part of the solution, because that's a source of uncertainty. Demand is not the only source of uncertainty, and as we mentioned, trends like lean manufacturing, offshore, and outsourcing, they all contribute to uncertainty. All right. Hurricanes, Hurricane Katrina, we have now recently Hurricane Sandy, and these things they actually have major implications on your supply chain. So just think about all the supply chains that were impacted by Hurricane Sandy recently. Now you have very abnormal demands for materials that would be used to repair homes and buildings and so forth. So just imagine how the supply chains are attempting to deal with those issues. All right. So natural disasters play a major role as well. Just showing you over time that supply chain management has evolved from the 50s, traditional mass manufacturing, inventory management, cost optimization, just-in-time, business process reengineering, and so on, strategic alliances in the 80s, and then we have supply chain formation and extension, so people are beginning to talk about collaborating a bit more, and then currently looking at refining supply chain capabilities, maybe doing greater partnering and collaboration, and really trying to optimize global supply chains. All right. So what's happening in terms of logistics costs? Well, as technology offers us a lot of capabilities over time, we're beginning to see costs declining, and that's really the trend that has happened over time. All right. What's happening in terms of the composition of logistics costs? So for inventory, transportation, administration, we're sort of seeing what's happening in terms of the relative composition of those different aspects, and we've seen that administrative costs tend to be very low, but the transportation costs tend to be the largest chunk of supply chain costs. All right, inventory carrying as well. With a lot of new technologies, just in time and so on, we've sort of kept inventory costs from growing unnecessarily large, but it's still an issue. However, transportation and logistics tend to be the bulk of supply chain costs, and if you could find ways to actually improve that, that will absolutely help. In terms of addressing some of the risk in the supply chain, we could certainly build redundancy into the supply chain, and redundancy might be in some cases, even using multiple suppliers for the same product, because you're hedging the risk by using more than one supplier. So if a supplier is not very reliable, let's say you have an 80% reliability, 80% of the time you will get what you want from them. Maybe if you have two suppliers with the same level of reliability, the overall reliability, will actually be improved, because when one may not be able to supply you, the other one might. And so the combination of the two unreliable suppliers is actually better than one unreliable supplier. Making better use of information to sort of do some forecasting. If there's some unusual events that's going to take place, for example, Brazil is expecting World Cup soccer in 2014. Well, that information, that's a disruptive event. And so that information can certainly be used to help companies do better planning around their supply chains. Somehow you could incorporate flexibility into supply contracts to allow for better matching of supply and demand, flexibility around prices, flexibility around order volumes, can certainly help. And then improving your supply chain processes by making sure that you design the processes to lower the risk associated with, poor forecasts, currency fluctuations, inventory levels, productivity issues, and so on. So that can certainly be looked into. Complexity, the magnitude, well, as we've already mentioned, that supply chains can be very simple or they could be quite complex. And so if U.S. companies are spending more than $1 trillion in supply chain related activities, this is not a simple environment. And so transportation 58%, inventory 38%, management 4%. Grocery industry could save $30 billion alone in terms of 10% of its operating costs, if it could use logistics more effectively. Think about this. A typical box of cereal spends about 104 days getting from a factory to a supermarket. And a typical new car takes about 15 days going from the factory to the dealer. So if you think about those performance metrics and you understand them, you'll see that there are lots of opportunities for improving performance in supply chains. All right? Just to kind of bring this section to a close, I just want to mention that supply chain managers have to have three critical abilities. One is the ability to match supply and demand. If you can't do that, supply chain costs are going to be out of whack, and then service levels are not going to be very good. The ability to replace traditional supply chain strategies where each individual optimizes their own objectives to one that optimizes the global chain. So much more collaboration and less sort of individualism. It's going to be a tough one because trust becomes a big factor in that environment. And then the ability to effectively manage risk, demand, lead times, yields, product life cycle changes, and so on. So all of those things become quite important. And what is the potential of supply chains? Well, as you could see here, Procter & Gamble estimated savings to retail customers are $65 million through its logistics gains. Dell Computer outperforming the competition in terms of shareholder value growth over more than 2 decades, over 3,000%, using direct business model and a built-to-order strategy. And so the savings in the supply chain when Dell was the hottest thing around was what that actually led to a significant factor in its competitive advantage. Walmart, of course, everyday low prices, we know that's their motto. Well, they obtained that by really improving the supply chain. That's what is built on, literally. Walmart's competitive advantage. So higher sales per square foot, inventory turnover, operating profit of any discount retailer. All right. So Key issues in the supply chain, when we think about those: inventory control, production sourcing, supply contracts, distribution strategies, strategic partnering, outsourcing and offshoring, product design, information technology, customer value, smart pricing. These are all things that we consider when we talk about managing the supply chain. Some of them have to do with global optimization of the chain. Some of them have to do with managing risk and uncertainty, but some of these issues actually span both of these areas. So hopefully this gives you a brief introduction to supply chain management. We will continue chapter 2 when we begin to explore inventory management and risk pooling.